Okay, lesson 9, part 2. So I have uploaded to GitHub in a new repository. If you need anything, Chris, glad you were able to get it working. There's the link if you need. So, and it just uploads the README file. And notice my node modules are not here because when we create the app with the Angular CLI, it automatically includes a git ignore that excludes node modules. So this is good. Our 240 megs of dependencies aren't here. So the repository is actually quite tiny in terms of file size, footprint. Okay, so our app is running. Stuff here. Okay, so what we want to do now is, the guts of our Angular applications are really our components. So it gives us a command here. We can try ng generate component, and then we'll build. So what we're going to build is an employers component so that we can create and display a dynamic list of employers. And then we'll create an employer form, and we can watch this two-way data binding in action. Seems like a lot to do in an hour, but we can do it. So first thing I'm going to do, clear out. So go to your terminal. So in your first terminal window, this window is kind of locked because in this window this is running our Angular server. So what you can do is just click on the plus sign here to make a new terminal. And it doesn't matter whether it defaults to Node or PowerShell, doesn't matter. So I have a second terminal in the root. So what I want to do is make a components directory inside of my source and app folder, and then we're going to create an employer component. So kind of similar to the job tracker we've been making. I'm going to type in from my root folder, I'm going to type in cd src /app. So I want to go inside of the source and app folder. So run cd src /app. And then we're going to run ng in here. Actually, first we're going to make a directory. I'm going to do mkdir components. So we're making a new folder called components. And then I want to change directory so you can see it in my file explorer. I now have under source and app, I've got a components directory. It's empty. So I'm going to do cd components. I'm now going to enter this new folder we just created. So we want to generate an employer component, but we want to put it in here. You don't have to put it in a subfolder. It's just a good way of organizing, because as our app gets bigger, we might have a whole series of Angular components. So having those in their own folder, I think, is useful. And then we're going to run the command ng new component, and I will call it employer. So this is going to build several files. It's going to create a component TypeScript file. It's going to create an HTML file, a CSS file. We don't need the CSS. We're really interested in the component file and the HTML file. So I'm going to run that command, ng, so we'll do cd components. I am putting these in the chat for you. And then ng new component employer. Oops, sorry, it's not ng new, it's ng generate component. Ng new creates a new project. My bad. I should read my instructions. Sorry about that. It's ng generate component employer. Ng new will build a entirely brand new application. So we don't want to build an application, we want to generate a component. So I will redo that, ng generate component. So this creates 4 files. There's our component TypeScript file. Most of our work is going to be in here. We've got our employer component that just has right now one line of HTML. There's the employer component CSS. We don't need this because we're going to use our global style sheet instead. And then there's this component.spec.ts. What this does, we don't touch this. This file is the one that converts our TypeScript code into, it transpiles it into plain old JavaScript at runtime. And so what we want to do now is we want to change our application. So instead of this app component loading when our site runs, we want it to load our employer component instead. Now, right now, the only thing on that page is just going to say employer works, right? Because that's in our, we go to our employer component.html, there's just this one paragraph tag. So we need to make two changes in order so that our employer page loads instead of our kind of default app page here. So the first place I'm going to go is back to our index.html file, which we've got open. So I want to change line 12. So right now, line 12, it's got this app root tag, and the app root, this loads our app component. Right, here's our selector of app root. So what should we change line 12 to be if we want it to load our employer component instead? We'll want to replace these app root tags with something else. So what should we put onto our index.html to load our employer page, our employer component instead? Say yes. So I've got to change something here. What would it be? So this right now is loading our app component with the selector of app root. What change should we make so that it loads our employer component instead? If you look at line 4. Okay, right, it is the name of the tag, so we can see it on line 4. So our employer component, so Colton, yeah, you were looking in the right place. Right. If we replace our app root with app employer, this should load the employer component, which then displays the employer component.html. It's fine. Okay, so I'm going to go to index. I'm going to change this app root to app employer in both the opening and closing tags. So hopefully this will load our new page. So now I'm going to go back and I refresh, and it sort of worked. The original template page isn't showing, but notice our employer page, our tag is here. It's good. Yet our employee component, it's supposed to show employer works. It didn't load. There's one more thing we need to do for this. And we need to go to our startup file, this app.module.ts. And you'll notice here down on line 18, there's a setting here for the bootstrap. So what component should load by default? This is setting a startup component. And here, it defaults to our app component. So if we want this to load the employer component instead, we're going to set the employer component as our bootstrap. So I'm going to change this from app component to employer component. So this is our startup. And now as soon as I go back to my browser, we get employer works, and we can see our default font is showing up here. It's using our default style sheet. So now we can load this component. So let's change this. We'll format the title, and then we'll start adding some dynamic data. So I'm going to go back to my employer component.html. I'm going to take out this line 1, and we'll replace it. We'll put in a title of job tracker, and let's style it. Give it an H1 tag, and we can use some of the classes that come in that default style sheet that we get with the Angular CLI. Class equals here. So we can use this card and highlight card. So this should give us a blue banner and put our text in white and bold. Right? So it automatically refreshes. Come on, puppy dogs. Okay, so now we've got a title on across the page. With just this one line. So what we want to do next in our component is we want to mock up. Let's create a list of mock employers, much like we did when we first created our Express application. Before we used MongoDB, we just mocked up some employers in our controller, and then we passed and rendered them to the view. We're going to do the same kind of the equivalent in Angular here. So if we go back and just kind of look at our job tracker Git repository, back from I think week 4, and we'll just open it up. You can look at those commits. So back in week 4, before we were using the database, if we look at the employers controller we made, right? So we mocked up the employers here, and then we passed them to the view. We're going to do the Angular equivalent of this. Now, next week, we'll fetch the employers from our Node Express backend from our database. But for today, we'll just mock them up, and then we'll look at how do we use Angular to generate those in a loop, and then we'll look at our two-way data binding. So in our Angular component, we're going to define, much like we did in our Express, we're going to kind of mock up this list. So we'll take a look at what this looks like. So in the component, before our component declaration, we will mock a list of employers to display. So I'll create a constant. We're going to first create a class. Bear with me. First, we'll come back to this. Create an employer class that is strongly typed. So we'll create a public class called employer. Again, this is similar to a Mongoose schema. And for now, let's say we'll define 3 properties of an employer. We'll give them an ID, which will be a number, a name, which will be a string, and a location, which will also be a string. Now here you can see TypeScript in action. I get these red lines under here, and it tells me you can't initialize them this way as nulls. So what I can do here to fix this is I can say our ID is a number or it's undefined. Notice when I add the or undefined, the red line, the error underneath my ID goes away. Now our Typescript checker, also it's checking, so my app I think should, until I fix those errors, okay, it's still compiling, I wasn't sure if it broke. So I'm gonna add these here as well. So string or undefined for each of my 3 properties. And then we're going to use this class to create a list of employers. I'll make a constant called employers, and I have to define it as a type. Remember, TypeScript, strongly typed. So our list of employers is an array of type employer. And now we can populate this array. They'll say ID, give it 100. We'll put in some of the employers that we had in our MongoDB. Whoops, this would be location. So we'll create 3 or 4 employers. Right, so we're populating 1 numeric property and 2 string properties. You can put in any employers you want, doesn't really matter. These guys are in Midland. So next week, again, we'll just select the data from the database, but for this week, we'll just mock it up inside of our component. So what we want to have happen is as soon as our component loads, we want to make this data available in our view. So when our component gets created, we will make the list available to the HTML view. So we'll create a variable here. So there's our code to mock up. We're creating a class. We're creating an array of 4 employer objects. And then we're creating a property called employers that we can access in our HTML. We can loop through and we should be able to display each one of these. So we'll use a loop, an Angular loop, to do this. Okay, I'll leave the code up for a minute. So starting on line 4, so we've added this part as well as I've added line 26. The rest of the code was already here, generated when we ran the Angular, the ng generate component command. So our next step is to go over to our employer component HTML and use a loop structure so that we can display and format our data. So I'm going to add on a section. I'll use a different class. We'll use the card container class from our style sheet. Then in here, I'm going to use a div. And we'll use this special directive star ng4 equals. So this is kind of like a for each loop, and this is our Angular directive. It starts with a star, and then it has this ng prefix. So we will use let e of employers. Remember, employers, this is our variable that's declared in the component. So we can access it in our view. We'll give this a class of. So this is going to loop through this ng4. This is going to loop through our employers array, our employers property, and each item in that array we can refer to as E. And then we'll maybe put out here, I don't know, maybe an H3, and let's display E dot name. So similar syntax to our handlebars loop, except we're using an Angular directive here instead. Excuse me. So we can try this out. Let's see what happens. So now when I go back here, it automatically refreshes and we get a card, right? One for each. Excuse me. One for each employer. So now underneath, we could also try to print out their location. So underneath our H3, we could maybe put in an E, and now we can try to output a location as well. And this should be in smaller text. Okay, it's here. Maybe the P tag isn't what we want. I'll try maybe an H5 instead. Oh, interesting, it's not wrapping. Okay, well, we'll just do it this way for now then. We'll just add the name and location. We can take out the H5. Excuse me. That'll look better. Okay, so we're mocking up the data in the component. We're making it available as a property called employers. And then we're using this ng4 directive to handle our loop. Excuse me. Now, we haven't done anything too revolutionary here. This is really just an Angular replica of what we've already done in Node and Express. We're mocking up some data in memory, we're passing it to the view, and then we're using a loop to render it. The next part is kind of neat though. So what we want to do down below, or on the other side of the page, is we'll do it down below. We want to build a little form that when we click on any employer, it will populate the form automatically. And then if we make changes in the form, we'll see, this is where we'll see the two-way data binding. When we make changes in the form, the list up above is going to update in real time. So let's try this out. So we'll create another section here. And maybe here we'll put on title that says employer details. Now we don't even need, when we're working with the Angular forms, we don't actually even need an HTML form tag. It's not a bad idea, but we don't even need one. I'll create one just for semantic HTML, but it's not even necessary. So we're going to create 3 field sets: a label and input pair for each of our three properties, ID, name, and location. And when we click on any employer in our list at the top, we want our form to be populated automatically. So I'll create a field set here. Create a label. And our form tags are going to look pretty different. All I'm going to do here is just give it an input. We'll copy and paste, so then we'll have ID, we got name, we got location. So we don't see anything different on our form right now. Probably because I didn't save anything. I'll save so we get a form. We can clean it up a little bit. Maybe we'll just create a simple class for our labels so that we can set a width for those so everything will be aligned nicely. So maybe in my label tag, we'll give it a class of LBL. And then we could define this class quickly in our style sheet. So I'll go to my style sheet, jump all the way down to the bottom. We'll define an LBL class. It'll just have a width of 75 pixels and display of inline one. So that's in our root style sheet. Okay, so this way this aligns. If we want, we could also get rid of the border on our field set tags. Looks kind of old and clunky. So I'll just set border. Okay, so we get our kind of nice clean form. So now we're going to enable the two-way data binding. So when I click on any employer, it automatically populates the ID, name, and location into the form. So I'm going to go back, and here's what we're going to do in our inputs. We're going to use this open a set of square brackets and then round bracket, and we're going to use ng model equals, and I'm going to pick the ID field. So we are binding, we want to bind this field to a property called ID. Our second field we're going to bind to a field called name. And our last field we'll bind a field called location. We're probably going to need to change this. This may have crashed our app. Let's see. Okay, well, it did crash because notice now nothing shows up here. So in order to get this to work, we're going to have to do a little configuration here. So we'll go back to our employer component. So we're going to set up some properties inside the component. We've got, let's see, we could do it a couple ways. We'll try it this way. ID, which is a number, undefined. Name, which is a string, or undefined. And then we want a method that when we click on an employer, it's going to populate the ID, name, and location. So we'll create a method called onSelect, which takes we'll try it this way, which is void. It doesn't return anything. Sorry, we'll have to pass in an ID as a number, name is a string, and a location is a string. So when we click on any employer, we'll pass in the ID, name, and location. So now we'll add some code to our employer HTML. When we click the list, it will then call our onSelect method and pass in that employer's ID, name, and location. So we'll define these three properties, and then we'll create an onSelect method that is going to read those properties from whichever. Okay, Colton. It basically says if there's no value, it's like defaulting it to null, basically. It will work without it, but my code editor complains. So I think it will still work, but the code editor says it should be initialized. So no, it does actually crash when we've got strict type checking on. So notice without that undefined, it says no in strict mode. You basically need to initialize them to nothing if they have no value. Notice when I put those in, it's gone. Now we're getting this, it's not loading. So we don't want the employer details to show up until we click on one of the employers above. So we can add a little logic here to say only show our form. We can use star ng if. We can add logic here. If we have an ID. So if the ID property is not null, the form will show. But when the ID is null or undefined, we want to hide the form. So when our page first loads, we don't want to see this form. We only want to see it once we've clicked on one of the employers in our list. So that form doesn't show up now. So we now want a click method that when we click one of these, it calls our onSelect method and passes in the ID, name, and location of that employer. Let's go back to my HTML. And I'm going to add into our card, when they click anywhere in the card, we can add a click handler this way. So an Angular click event in round brackets equals, and now we're going to pass in, actually it would be simpler. I'm going to rewrite the method a little bit. Rather than passing each property in individually, we should just be able to pass the whole employer object. So this is going to give me an error because our onSelect method is expecting 3 arguments. I'm going to rewrite the onSelect method to make it a little simpler. Instead of passing all 3 parameters, we can just pass this object, this variable, because it contains all 3 properties. So we'll add that click handler, and then we're going to go modify our onSelect. I'm going to go back here. Instead of taking all 3 of these, we can just say it takes employer, which is a type employer. So now we can just read the properties this way. So when we click any object in our list, we're passing the whole object, and then we can just read the ID, property, name, and location strings. I think that makes the error in our HTML go away now. So we're passing the whole object. And once our ID property gets set, our form should magically become visible. Because there's logic in our form that says if there is an ID, if ID is not undefined, then this whole HTML block should become visible. We'll try this out. I'm going to save. Okay, now we're getting there, but something still isn't quite right. We need to do one more thing in our site configuration to get this to work. And that is, we need to go back to our app.module.ts. And because we're trying to load values and display a form, we need to add a reference to the Angular Forms module. So we're going to import Forms module from Angular Forms, and we need to add it to the list of imports here. So we're going to add lines 9 and 19. We won't be able to work with our form and using it to display dynamic data. That isn't going to work without the Forms module. So we're going to import we may need one other one to get this to work. I think we need one more dependency here as well. We do, which is this one. It's called the browser may have to install this one separately. Bear with me for just 1 second. Let's see what's going on. We're almost done, almost there. we need? I think we may have to install one more package in order to show or hide. Do we need that? Okay, we're going to install this one package. I think we're going to need this. I'm just going to double check. Bear with me. Okay, we will install it just to be sure, and I think we'll need to reference it. I'll try it out in mine first. Go back to my terminal. I'm going to install the Angular platform browser. You don't have to do this yet. I'm going to see if this makes the difference in mine. I think we'll need this, so I'm going to install that dependency. I will add it in to my reference list. So I'm going to import the reference. And then I will add it to my list of modules here. I'm going to go back and see if that makes the difference. Okay. We're not too far off. String contains an invalid character. So one small issue. We'll just check. Oh, my ng model tags, I've done these. Sorry, are equals. These have to go outside after our curly brace. It's like this. So the ng model is fully enclosed in our round bracket and curly bracket. So I will move the equals. So syntax error in my code. Okay, so now we're getting another error in the console. It should be loading now, but it says if ng model is used within a form tag, either the name attribute must be set or the form control must be defined as standalone. So it says we should add a name attribute to our inputs as well, or add this. So that's fine. We can simply add those name attributes. No problem. So give it a name of ID. Name is name. Name is location. So I'll just add those HTML attributes. So now when I click, now my form loads dynamically. Right? Each of the three inputs change as we select. Now here's where the real power of Angular comes in. If I change something in my form, I was expecting this would change up here, but it isn't. Our two-way data binding should be working, that if we change our form, it should automatically update our list. I wonder if my form tags should come out. I'm going to actually take them out. That is not a problem. Okay, well, the other thing I will do is I'll just add a simple method to clear this out. Think about why this is not. This should be updating in real time for us. Okay, I think I know why. I'm just going to rewrite this a little bit. We'll just create a single object for the selected employer. And then we'll say this dot selected employer. I think that should bind them properly now. Okay, I've got to change my if statement in my HTML, so this should now be if there is a selected employer. Sorry, I'm refactoring some of this code. So we'll use a whole object instead. Okay. So now if I make a change in my form, there, that was the change I needed. Notice as I type in the form, there's our two-way data binding. So as we change the form, it changes my list above. So the form and the underlying data model, these are always going to be in sync this way. Sorry for the confusion. I should have done it this way in the beginning. Thought I could take a shortcut. Now, the one last thing we'll do is add a button here. There's no way to clear the form. So if I make a change, I should then just be able to clear out my form and hide it. So I'll just put a button on there that when we click it, it'll hide. Give it a class of btn that says hide reset. We can style our button as well. We'll just use this btn class. Here's some CSS for it. We could dump that in our style sheet. We'll make it a blue button with white text. move it over. And then we'll write a little click handler that when you click it, the form disappears. So we'll add an Angular click handler. We'll create a method called reset form that gets called whenever you click. And I'm getting an error here because this method doesn't exist. So we need to create a reset form method in our component. So we'll go and do that. And then this little Angular app is done. So we'll create a reset form method, which is void. It doesn't return anything. And we can just say this.selectedEmployer. We'll set it to undefined. So that will clear out the employer. That should automatically hide the form and empty the form inputs. We can click, and as soon as I click hide, what did I? Click a button, the class, click handler. So when our selected employer should be set to null, to undefined. Just read, maybe I need to. There, okay. And I just needed to refresh my page. I assumed it had refreshed automatically and it hadn't. So now we can click. We have our two-way data binding. So I update the form, it updates the list. That data persists here. And I'm all done making my changes. I can just hide my form. So you can see this two-way data binding happening between our form and our list, that they're always going to be in sync. And we can show or hide items using our ng-if directive. So we've really introduced a few new directives in our view syntax. We've got ng-for for loops. We've got click event handlers for any kind of HTML element, whether it's a div or a button. We've got ng-if that will show or hide a block of HTML or an HTML element, depending on whether some Angular property has a value or is null. And then we've used ng-model so that we can set up this two-way data binding between a form element and a property in our component class. And then our handlebar syntax, well, we're familiar with that already. Okay, is it still not working for you? I will go over the browser animations module. Without that, does yours work, or I assume it doesn't? Okay, so for the browser animations module, in the terminal, so go back to your root folder of the project. So outside, if you got to go up 3 levels, right? Because we're in components, app, source. So type cd ... 3 times, just so you're back in the root folder. And in the root folder, you will install the Angular platform browser. Put the command in the chat. And then I'll show you there's 2 changes we need to make to app.module.ts. So this is our Angular configuration. So I've added lines 10 and 21. Imported the browser animation module. And I've added it to the list of module imports on line 21. Our application took a little bit of pain to get there. I'm sorry for the pain. But now we've got this dynamic two-way data binding where our form and our list, they're always going to be in sync. We can show hide components. So I will upload this up to GitHub. And then what we'll do next week is we'll build a new Angular app, a new Angular front end. And then we're also going to reconfigure and kind of simplify and strip down our Node and Express server so that it works as an API. And it will feed the data into the Angular front end. So we won't be using Handlebars view templating. We won't be rendering any views in our controllers. We're simply going to use the Node Express backend as an API that will talk to the database and serve and receive JSON. But all of the front end things will happen within Angular. So we'll do that over the next 2 classes. Then we'll also learn how do we, we'll have 2 apps running separately. So how do we bundle and package up and integrate the Angular app and then deploy it? Okay, so today was really just, I know Angular might seem overwhelming, like we did a lot and it's confusing. That's okay, it's the first lesson of 3, so we're gonna work with it again. And so please remember, Lab 2 is due Monday night. So please reach out to your partner and send them your assignment 2 so that you can get their feedback moving forward on your build for assignment 3. Okay, I will upload to GitHub. If anybody has questions and need help, I'm happy to stick around extra for a little while. Okay, and if not, have a nice weekend. Hopefully you can breathe easy.